Well, great. It is April 27th, a little before 10 a.m. And I'm here with Tim Johnson to conduct part 2 of his interview. Tim was our pilot interview, our first interview for this second round of the oral history process, the updated oral histories. So it's been a while since we talked to him. We last spoke in July. So good morning, Tim. It's good to have you in this conversation and to see you again. I want to start this conversation off today by thinking about broad concepts, broad themes about some of your cases. So I wanted to think specifically about what a typical case might look like, knowing that, of course, every case is different. There is no typical case at CRS. And many of the questions are broad, and I might have follow-up conversations for you, but I wanted to start with roadblocks specifically. What kinds of roadblocks, what themes of roadblocks would you encounter in your efforts to work with parties effectively? And how did you overcome or try to overcome those roadblocks?
Okay, a typical case would involve a complaint by a community group concerning some level of what they perceived as discriminatory practice. That might be a problem with the school system, a problem with the local government, a problem with the police department. So the first roadblock or obstacle was making contact with the parties, well, really making contact with both parties, both the complainant and the complainers. And one of my big problems was we would get information by phone. And this was before Zoom. And then when I showed up, people would say, wait a minute, you white. So I had to overcome that. Or people, I would show up and people would say, well, you're with the Department of Justice. We don't trust you. So the local school would want to talk to the local city attorney. The local police would want to talk to their general counsel. Just fear that the federal government was going to do something that might hinder them or slow them down or cost them money or things like that. The way I generally got over those objections was for the community people to say, this is your opportunity to move further with your concerns so that you can move towards some sort of resolution. I will cost you no money. I will provide you guaranteed confidentiality, and I will be neutral. I won't be on your side, and I won't be on their side. Now, if that's okay with you, what I'll do is I'll reach out to the other side and see if they would be interested in doing what Lyndon Johnson recommended that we do, and that is sit and reason together. Now, I can't guarantee what the other side's going to say, but with your permission and your support, I will go and reach out to those people, the school, the police, the government, whoever, and explain to them what you've told me and give them the same offer, an opportunity to sit down with a neutral third party to see if we can't reason this out without courts, without publicity, without cost. If you want to go that way, I'm your guy. Now, if I were in a place where I or CRS had been before, I could say, well, you know me, you know what I do. Let's do it again, and that would reach out. The obstacles had to do with fear, cost, and bad publicity. and I can say that 99% of the time, I was able to get over those. The times that I weren't, or I wasn't able to get over it, was when there was prearrangement. People already made up their minds that they're going to shut the city down, or they're not going to deal with those people, those kinds of things. And in which case, I would say, I'm a mediator. I have to have two sides willing to talk. If I don't have that, you have to move on to another alternative. Some of those alternatives are fold up your tent, go home and forget about it. Hire a lawyer, go to court. Or go to the US attorney if you think that there's a federal law involved. But I'm not your alternative. So God bless you. Have a nice day.
Yeah, I recall you saying during the first part of the oral history that you referencing the sit and reason together phrase, you also highlighting that this was the best opportunity for people to make their own choices and decisions. And so these are ways, as you state, to get over the fear, the cost, and the bad publicity. You talked about the community folks, going to the community folks first. What about if government calls you in and you went to the government folks first? Would they have similar concerns, and how did you get over those struggles with them?
Same way. The beauty of CRS is its confidentiality, its neutrality, and the fact that we don't cost anything, that we are an opportunity. Much like in policing, a police officer can respond to a situation and he can respond, or she can respond hard or soft. A soft response would, let's sit down and problem solve. Let's sit down and see if we can't resolve this so I won't have to come back. A hard response would be, if you don't do what I tell you right now, you're under arrest. Well, nobody wants to be under arrest and nobody likes the hard way. So I always would offer them the opportunity to fix it yourself. And like I say, 99% of the time, that was good enough. They would say, yes, we'll give that a shot.
So you also mentioned that one of the other hurdles was that people said to you, "You're a white guy. How are you going to help us in this scenario?" And I know in the prior conversation you mentioned some of your colleagues were Black or not white, and you shared some illustrations about who's this white guy. Parties referencing who's this white guy in the room for this conversation. But what ways would you be able to gain entry into that conversation if you were working on your own? When parties say to you, "Well, why DOJ send us this white guy to help us with this issue?"
Right. I would again stress the agency's neutrality. I would also stress that I'm not going to do anything. You are. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to tell you what to say. I'm not going to tell them what to do or what to say. What I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you a table so that you can sit and reason together. Right? That's all I do. Right? Now, if you want somebody to come in and be your advocate, then go to ACLU. That's not what we do. What we do is we offer an opportunity for you to solve your own problems with the people that are here. And if you do that, then the solutions are going to last. If I leave and the Civil Rights Division comes in and does some sort of consent decree, that's not solving the problem. So, I agree that I am white, and this is a situation of people of color alleging a white influence agency, the school, the police, whoever, treating them unfairly. I'm willing to sit down and talk with you and get them to sit down, and then the two of you can talk together.
Did you have any specific strategies when participants said to you, look, we don't trust DOJ, and you're with DOJ? You've talked about, confidentiality. We know there's a firewall between CRS and the rest of DOJ through the statute, which is part of that confidentiality. But were there other ways that you tried to or were able to build trust quickly with the parties when they said, look, we don't trust you, you're from DOJ?
Yeah. What I would say to them is, again, you don't have to trust me. I'm not going to do anything. I have the best job in the world. I don't do anything. And what I can provide you is the opportunity for you to sit down and you to make decisions and you to make proposals and you to follow through on them. I'm not part of the deal. All I'm going to do for you is provide the table. And you guys are going to have to work it out. Now, I've done this 1,000 times. And one of the things that I found is that sometimes if you have a neutral third party, outside third party, they can come up with questions you haven't thought of. They can come up with directions you haven't thought of. And they can present those. You can reject them. You can say, no, that's absolutely not what we want to do. Right? That's fine. That's fine. Because the bottom line is, at the end of this process, you either resolved the situation or you didn't. I didn't resolve it. You either resolved or you didn't. And that's up to you.
Great. So were there any circumstances that you can recall where folks said, look, we're not going to engage? And what about from outsiders? So perhaps there were folks protesting CRS's involvement, or the media was identifying or writing about concerns with CRS's involvement. Did you ever encounter pushback from the parties themselves or from outsiders with respect to your engagement as a CRS conciliator?
Yeah, very rarely. Rarely, because what I did was, during the assessment process, try to underscore the importance that this is not a political situation. This is a personal situation between two parties. Right? And that if the parties were going to make any headway, any progress, they were going to have to agree to sit down and do the work. I had some occasions where one side or the other reached out to the media, and that just confused things. And the media would call me, and I would say, well, I don't talk to the media, talk to our public relations people. And the public relations people had a canned speech that they gave, about our confidentiality and all that. So I very rarely had any problems with that. I had some issues where I was misquoted or taken out of context. And then people at headquarters would say, that's terrible, don't ever do that. And I would say, but I didn't. And they would say, well, it looked like you did, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that I can imagine how you might get pushback from headquarters for being taken out of context. Can you say more about the roles that media played? Perhaps there were some relationships that you had with media in particular circumstances where they had a positive influence or a positive role in a particular process, or posed more challenges.
Yeah, I made it a policy not to have any relationship with any media. If I were faced with media, I was, in situations where there were protests and riots and things like that, and my picture would get taken, and they'd want to know, what's your name? And I would say, I'm with the United States Department of Justice, Community Relations Service. If you have any question, please call this number and ask for Darrell Borquist, who was at that time the media guy. It never helped me to have media. And quite often it became an obstacle. So my policy was, don't have anything to do with it.
So was there a point early in your career as a conciliator where you were engaging the media and you learned lessons from that? Are there any lessons that you can extract, or was it always your policy?
It was I drilled into me when I first started in New York, which has, the New York Post and the Daily News and other rags, to do as little as possible in contact with those folks. I did have a community-wide meeting of people in the borough of Brooklyn. It involved probably 100 or so people. The borough presidents and his staff, the police department, the school people, civil rights organizations, and that was pretty heavily covered by local press. And the reporters, wanted to know who was I, and how did this meeting come about, things like that. And they wrote a very positive article about the people in Brooklyn coming together to try and iron out some of their issues. That's really the only time I can remember the media being a positive influence.
Oh, thanks. So I want to shift a little bit to success and goals. You have talked a little bit about how CRS itself measured success. We talked about closing cases and getting to a certain number of reports. Specifically, you mentioned conversations with your supervisor. Okay, I've closed the 40 or 50 reports. Can I go home for the next 9 months? But I wanted to talk about your goals and what success meant to you, Tim. What did success mean to you in a particular intervention where you worked in a community in a typical case?
Yeah, one of the reasons people don't leave CRS, I believe, is the immense satisfaction that a conciliator gets when it works. I can remember going to a town or a city where there was just open animosity and hostility between the community groups and the local school, police, or whoever. And going through the whole process, getting them to sit down and start reasoning together, and then sitting back and really not doing anything. And at the end, having the parties agree on very specific plans and very specific ideas about how to go forward together. Right? And at the end, they would say to me, well, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for being here, but we really don't need you. Right? And I can remember being in my little government car, driving home all by myself, thinking to myself, yes, I did it, yes. I was just so thrilled, that it worked perfectly to plan. I still feel that way today. The only thing you've done is provide a vehicle, right? They drove the bus. Wherever the bus went is because that's where they steered it. And, granted, you provide the environment, you provide the table, you provide the, they say, well, all right, the Department of Justice is here, so we'll sit down and talk, that kind of influence. But the bottom line is that what you really provide is an opportunity for people to communicate with each other without the fences and the shields and the animosity. And they say, well, all right, as long as he's here, we'll talk. But then 5 minutes later, I don't even need to be there. So yeah, that's, I've had hundreds of times in my little government car, just feeling really, really good about what I did, or about what they did is a more accurate way of saying it. Saying, yes, I did this, yes, yes. Because without that, there would be no resolution. And it would just grow and grow and grow and grow. And then we would have citywide violence or people not reaching their full potential. So what a wonderful opportunity for people to, like me, to have a job that pays them to do that.
And I can feel your energy in this conversation about sitting back and then saying, you can go. And you in your car, I can feel that even now. I wonder, when you go into this conversation, when you intervene in the community, was your goal typically to get to a settlement for a specific limited situation, or did you try to secure larger systemic change?
What an excellent question. We had a regional director, and you mentioned P. Diane Snyder. She worked directly for him. I worked with him before P. Diane even came on board. His name was Robert Lamb. Mr.
You mentioned him in the last conversation specifically. He may have coined the sacred trust term.
Yes, yes. Mr. Lamb would always talk about capacity change. Did you change the capacity? Like he would say, okay, if you're going to go and resolve a excessive use of force case, you're going to go and you're going to get the people who complained about excessive use of force, and you're going to get the police department, and they'll come to some sort of agreement. That's not good enough. What you got to do is you got to have the community and the police agree on policy change, practice change. What are they going to do next year, the year after? And I always felt that headquarters cared more about the immediate than the long range. Mr. Lamb would always, he and I would discuss cases, and he would say, okay, what about 5 years from now? Did you mention anything having to do with the training? Did you mention anything that might involve annual reviews? Did you mention, and he'd think of 1,000 things. So yeah, I would always try to look for long-term solutions. Sometimes both parties would balk at that and say, no, we just want to solve this. And it's their show, so it wasn't my job to advocate.
Yeah, so you're always looking for space and opportunity to open the door to develop long-term systemic change, but the parties have to walk with you,
yeah,
and take advantage of that opportunity, and you're not going to force them to do it. Okay. That makes sense. So I want to talk about changes that you observed over the course of your career or post your career. Specifically, how did or does now, from your perspective, the increased political polarization of the country did it impact your work? How does it impact the work of CRS now? I note that you are taking the perspective when you're gaining entry to take this out of politics and say, look, I'm not here because of politics. I'm not here to address a political situation. But I'm wondering if that becomes an increasing challenge, or if you noticed a shift throughout your career at CRS and post your career at CRS.
Yeah, I retired in 2012, and I don't think that the animosity between the left and the right was as deep then as it is now. And social media is not or was not as prevalent then as it is now. So the challenges are far greater. There's a woman, Mallory McSomething, I can't remember her last name. She's a state senator in Michigan. She recently was accused by the right wing of being a groomer, encouraging pedophilia and things like that. And she responded to that really well, I thought, by pushing back, saying, I won't talk about that. I will tell you who I am. I will tell you what I'm trying to do. I will tell you what programs I'm trying to start, as opposed to marginalizing anybody. And I did not run into that level of division. I ran into racism. I ran into, resistance to change, but not, I don't think, to the degree of what it is today. We did not have QAnon, for example, when I was with CRS. And if you told me, well, there's somebody who's going to spread the rumor that the vaccination for COVID will eventually cause everybody who got the vaccination to have AIDS, which is something that was recently said by QAnon or whoever. Now, you're an educated man, you know how stupid that is. There are legions of people who just accept that. And we did not have that kind of challenge when I was active.
So I'm hearing two separate types of polarization. One is through fake news and the proliferation of it on social media, perhaps. The other is by targeting particular individuals and making allegations, whether they're fake news or not. I don't, perhaps they are fake news. Did you ever deal with circumstances where there was fake news or false stories about the work you were involved with, and how did you go about it, addressing that in the context of the mediation or conciliation?
Yeah, I dealt with people who would make assumptions, and the assumptions would be, well, those people are NAACP, you can't talk to them. Or those people are the school board, you can't talk to them. Or those people are police, you can't talk to them. And so people would make assumptions, they have stereotypes they'd say, every time I've dealt with any police officer in this police department, it's been negative. Every time. You say, okay. I understand, sympathize, and I'm sorry that happened. However, if we are to make any progress, we need to sit down and talk about it. Now, I can talk to you till the cows come home. Won't make any difference. I'm gonna get paid anyway, and you have a lovely city here. I'm enjoying my time here. So if you want me to come back and you yell at me about whatever you want to yell at me about, okay. But you're not going to make any progress unless the other side sits down with us and both sides agree to work towards a solution. Now, you say, well, I could never trust this police department. Okay, then there's no point in not talking. Either you can sincerely commit to open communication, and they can sincerely commit to open communication, or I don't have two sides that are willing to talk. Right? My magic is that you agree and they agree to at least sit down and begin talking and build the resolution you want to see in your town. Might be different from the resolution in Boston or LA or Newark or Richmond. It's built for you. It's your town in your area in your here and now. So again, it's just a question of trying to get people to say, okay, let me suspend judgment long enough to sit down and actually listen to the other side.
The connection to assumptions is interesting, and I think valuable, that fake news and misleading information, as I've described them, or as we think about them in our current context, are really just assumptions that have been compounded and distributed to the masses, that people believe. They bought into these assumptions for one reason or another. Maybe assumptions is too kind of a word, but the folks who are believing these ideas are making assumptions about them, that the source is trusted, that the information should be trusted for one reason or another. And so the connection to assumptions is really helpful from my perspective. I did notice also that you raised social media. And I know social media had not proliferated by 2012 in the way that it has now.
Right.
But people were tweeting about things, and certainly on Facebook in 2008, 2012. And so I wonder, towards the tail end of your career, did you see any benefits to social media from a conciliator's perspective? Did you see any hurdles to social media that pose challenges to your work?
No, I did not involve myself with it. I didn't see any point in it. I see both positive and negative impacts. On a positive side, the Black Lives Matter movement became possible and grew primarily from social media. And it allowed people in diverse communities all over the country to reach out to one another and say, okay, what do we want to do about this, and how do we want to go forward? But at the same time, there were other forces at play that would say outlandish things on both sides, both the left and the right, that were either partially true taken out of context, or not true at all, that would influence people. As I understand it, the media in Russia has said that scenes of mass casualties, civilian casualties that were shown on TV were staged. And so if I'm, just a regular Joe in Russia, and I'm watching the news, I go, well, look at what those people did over there in Ukraine. They staged all this just to make us look bad. So who are you going to believe? You're going to believe, your Lester Holt or my Lester Holt? And so it becomes very, very confusing. And I think that people take advantage of the confusion to further their own influence or power or make money. So yeah, I did not, thankfully, face that challenge. And I think if I were still in CRS, I would be aiming at local people for local issues and local solutions. Let's not worry about what Biden said or what McCarthy said and who lied and who didn't lie. Let's worry about Podunkville right here. The people that live here and work here. Let's see what kind of progress we can make right here, right now.
Yeah, so you're Lester Holt, and Lester Holt, and it seems that is the person who people might trust. Do you trust your Lester Holt? So some of the social media, some of the news comes really back to the core themes of trust, and I appreciate you sharing that perspective, particularly given that retiring in 2012, your experience with social media was limited. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. You mentioned some of the other forces on the right and the left. And I want to ask you a few questions about those two sets. I'm going to separate them out. The other forces on the right and the left and Black Lives Matter. But let's start with Black Lives Matter and similar organizations. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, if I'm recalling correctly, really started to emerge about 10 years ago after Trayvon Martin's death in Ferguson. And that's the time when you were really retiring. But I don't know if you have any observations that you want to share about the emergence of Black Lives Matter in similar movements in demonstrations and connection with your experience at CRS.
Yeah, I welcome the existence of any social movement because it creates attention and it creates opportunities for dialogue. People would argue blue lives matter, meaning police. All lives matter. And people would feel bad because they didn't feel included. Why is it just Black lives? Why can't it be brown lives? Why can't it be Indian lives? Why, that kind of thing. So all that does for me is gives me an opportunity to get all people to sit down and talk about all the issues and all the concerns that they have about getting along with one another, about being treated fairly, about being respected, about having the same opportunities, things like that. So, yeah, do I think Black Lives Matter? Absolutely. Let's sit down and talk about it. And somebody will say, well, I feel excluded. Then let's get you, come to the table. Let's talk about it.
So you're seeing these social movements from a conciliator's perspective as an opportunity to bring people into conversation.
Absolutely.
What about those who say, look, this is a demand for justice? And simply by me coming to the table with you at DOJ, with others who aren't supporting these demands for justice, and simply by coming to the table, I'm abandoning those demands. And I have no interest in coming into that conversation and coming into that dialogue. How do you approach your work as a conciliator with respect to individuals taking that position?
Oh, you might not care about a particular issue. You might not think that there's a need for change, adjustment, or fine-tuning policies and procedures within an institution. Other people have that feeling. Why not sit down and talk about it? Now, recently there was a police killing of a African immigrant in, I believe, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in talking with my police friends, they're adamant, absolutely justified. Absolutely justified. The guy took the officer's taser and did not give it back. Absolutely justified. Whereas my non-law enforcement friends say, absolutely unjustified. First of all, when the guy started running away, cops should have just let him go. He still had the guy's car, right? So he just should have let him go. And, go into his house later on and say, Joe, you shouldn't have run away, and that's only compounded the problem. And now we're going to have to talk about it. If we can get people to start to consider other alternatives, not black and white, not either or, but other alternatives. What should a police officer do in a situation like that? Are there ways the police officer can avoid that situation to begin with? When is it okay for a civilian to run away? Now, I don't know what this man's experience with policing was in Africa. And he may have been thinking, oh my God, this guy's going to kill me. And the police officer, of course, had no intention of that. He was just doing his job. So is there room for people to sit down and start talking about the structure of law enforcement in America? Do we always have to end up with an arrest? Are there times when we can do something else? And that's been an ongoing battle. Do I think that, are there people in America who do not think that racism exists? And of course there are. There are millions of people who just don't see it. Okay. All right. What do we do with that? Well, one thing we can do is we can sit down and start talking about it. Well, I grew up tough. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and we only had 1 bathroom, and we didn't have any money for anything. And I pulled myself up by the bootstraps.
You're referring to a common refrain that you're hearing from folks, not your personal experience. Just
actually, that is my personal experience.
Okay.
But I would also add that I had a loving mother and a loving father and a fabulous upbringing. And when people start talking about how poor you were, I can only talk about how rich I was, how lucky I was to have literacy, for example. We didn't have a TV when I was a kid. So my mother would say, nothing better than curling up with a good book. Well, I walked into school reading. My children walked into school reading. Our daughter, when she was in middle school, had already read the entire reading list of the high school. And I mean, it's just, that was her environment. That was where she was. Okay. So when people say, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, what if you don't have any boots? Much less straps, and what can we do in terms of helping people to level the playing field just a little bit? Now, there are folks who will say, I did not get promoted because they promoted a black guy, affirmative action, something like that. Okay, maybe. What else didn't you get? Overall, when you add everything up, clearly in America, it's more advantageous to be white than it is to be black at every level. So convincing white people that racism exists is a continuous challenge.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising Patrick Lyoya. It's Lyoya. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his last name, and what you're hearing from colleagues in Grand Rapids in this conversation about white privilege and racism. I want to shift a little bit away from, and I like. I have to cut this part out, the stumbling. Sorry. I want to go back and just pick up on a theme that you highlighted. If it creates a tension, you're talking about Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, et cetera, all lives matter, then that's an opportunity for dialogue.
Yes.
And so that's a byproduct of social movements, but that's a byproduct of community tensions that you were called into. Do you want to say more about the value of tension in creating space for conversation as a considerator?
Without it, nobody wants to talk. I would not have any cases as a conciliation specialist unless there were tensions, unless there were somebody angry and somebody upset and somebody feeling like they were at their final straw. So tension is good because it brings attention to situations that need to be discussed. If I say that the school system is unfair, that the school system is unconsciously racist, and then I go and I talk to the kids, and the kids agree, without my saying, there's a racism in the school. The kids will say, well, mostly white kids are in the advanced placement. Teachers call mostly on white kids. Kids of color are mostly disciplined harsher than white kids. And these are students telling me this. Then I have to assume, well, they're probably right. So, but if I go to the faculty and I say, well, faculty, you racist bunch of bigots, they're not going to respond to that. But if I go to the faculty and I say, this perception that the kids have, what can we do about it? What do you want to do about it? How can things be changed to make things more, to appear more equal for everybody? what can you do? And I've done this in several schools, and there are groups of teachers who are dyed in the wool and won't change, and say, no, I'm here to teach math, and if the kid can't learn math, then I'm not going to play with them. I'm not going to do anything. There are other teachers who will say, I come in early. I come in at 7 o'clock and offer tutoring to any kid who's behind in my class. And I do that on my own time. I don't get paid for that. And all I can do when I meet somebody like that is just kind of be in awe of that's a professional. That's, a real professional. I know that there are police officers who will stay on their beats extra time just to meet people, right? They don't get paid for that. Not part of their, they just want to know. That's professional law enforcement. So in talking with groups of police officers or teachers or government employees or citizens, I ask, for example, show me the guy who stays late or comes in early, is that a direction that you would like to see more people go in?
That's a great example. And what it recalls for me in our last conversation, I just want to pick up on and connect a thread real quick. Because you said, look, right now CRS is staffing at 30 or however many conciliators they have. It's not more than a few dozen, right? They can only respond to major events.
Right.
The Selmas, the Fergusons, the summer of 2020, good golly, they had a lot of work on their plate, right?
Right.
But what they should really be doing, this is from your prior conversation, what they should really be doing is going after the small points of tension before they become these big points of tension. And I think what you're describing with the school district tension is a small point of tension in a community before it engulfs a community. That CRS perhaps could play that role to address small points of tension, to bring people into conversations in a way that you just described. Is that a vision that you would have for CRS with unlimited resources?
Yes, I would envision CRS to have more time, more people, and more money to get people to come together to talk, to get people to come together proactively as opposed to reactively. Proactive, for example, by saying to a community and a police department, what makes a great police department? What makes great police community relations? Who should be involved in that? What can police do to improve? What can community members do to improve? How often should dialogues take place? What should the schools be teaching and looking at in terms of internal problems where people might feel disrespected, people might feel discounted? What can we do about that? How can we keep more people connected? I had a session yesterday. One of the things I do here is a thing called restorative reflections, where juveniles from the state's attorney's office are referred to me and another mediator to sit down and talk about what they did, what they were thinking at the time, what they're thinking now. These are all restorative justice questions. And I asked this kid who's 16, I said, what school do you go to? He said, oh, I'm not going to school. I said, oh, You dropped out? He said, no, I just stopped going. And I thought to myself, you know, I would want to sit down with the school board, the school administration, and the PTA, and say, how can that happen? How can a kid just stop going? And this kid just stopped going. Now, granted, he was not intellectually very bright. And he was 16 years old going into ninth grade. That's what he told me. He said, well, I said, are you going to go to school? He said, yeah, I may go next year. What grade will you be in? Ninth, at 16. So, you know, cracks, people, and there are huge cracks fall through. And those are the kinds of things that I would say CRS could help people dialogue about.
So Tim, you're talking about proactive work and identifying cracks, and I want to know the opportunity that you've described to bring people to the table revolves around tension. So how do you get people to the table, the right people to the table, the busy decision makers to the table, or their surrogates, when the tension's not there, or they're not hearing the tension in this proactive manner?
Right.
How do you get them to the table? How do you get them to buy in? How do you get them to make decisions and plan?
Yeah, huge challenge in terms of finding the time, finding a place, and making it convenient enough for everybody. I used to say, if you feed them, they will come. And my approach would be to go to, well, first to sit down and figure out who are the players, who do I want at the table for any given situation, and then go to the leadership of those players and say, we can wait until there's violence. That's fine. Or if you'd like, you can be a little more aggressive than that. You can put the fire out before, you can step on the fire and put it out. Or you can wait until it's a raging inferno and burns everything. You'll still be able to put it out, but you'll lose a little bit more property, a little bit more value, a little bit more community-wide peace. So we can do this for you. What I would envision, Sarah saying, we have a meeting room at the Holiday Inn. Please come at 7 o'clock and represent your city, your school, your police department, your church, your civic organization, whatever it is. And let's just talk. Now, you say, what should we talk about? I'm going to ask you, what should we talk about? Right? So let's write an agenda that you want about community peace, about racial tension, about discriminatory practice. What, you tell me, and we'll write that down, and that's what we'll talk about. And if people say, well, I just don't have time for that. I've got a full-time job, and I got to go home. I got kids. I don't have time. Then you don't have time. Then we don't have a dialogue.
What do you have any examples of where a process like that has worked from your time at CRS, if you were able to engage in?
Yeah, I think that CRS has had experiences with community-wide dialogues, and I think there's been several of them. I mentioned earlier the one in the borough of Brooklyn. That took some doing, and took a lot of scampering around, talking to different people. But I found, probably took, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks of making contact with various leadership people. But that was a little easier than it would be to just spring it on some small town somewhere who doesn't have a feeling of need or problem. Brooklyn at the time definitely had problems, and they definitely knew about it. So it was a little easier. But community-wide opportunities for dialogue would be I think, would go a long way towards early identification of issues, earlier solutions to those issues, and more cooperation between desperate people or groups. But not with the current CRS, because the current CRS doesn't have the staff, the money, and like I said, and you mentioned earlier, they're in a response mode, not in a proactive mode.
When you were at CRS, did you ever partner with other organizations to stretch your services, other state organizations or federal or local
Yes.
organizations?
Yes. And we had a program called SPIRIT, School Problem Identification Resolution of Issues Together. And that required people from the community to go into a school, and non-teachers, right, and people who didn't have any kids in that school, just community members, to go into the school and facilitate groups of kids talking about whatever the problems were. To do that, I would go to local churches, NAACP, Chamber of Commerce, other organizations, and ask for volunteers to come and help me. In Pennsylvania, they developed, the State Human Rights Commission developed a cadre of people to help with SPIRIT programs. And so we had an ongoing relationship. So we would say, we got a situation in Podunkville, Pennsylvania high school. Can you get us 10 members of your SPIRIT cadre? And they would say, yeah. And sure enough, they'd show up. And so yeah, in that sense, we definitely did coordinate and collaborate.
Great. Thanks for sharing that example. Concurrently, did you ever get any pressure from other agencies or elected officials saying something like, hey, look, you stay in your lane, don't come in this community?
Yes.
Can you share some of those examples? If you're comfortable.
Yeah, I went to a town that had major complaints about city government. Spoke to them. Went to the city government and said, here's what the people have said. And here's what I offer. I offer you the opportunity to sit down, neutral setting, and see if you don't want to talk about this. Their response was to call their senator, the US senator, to complain that I was causing problems in their city. The state or the federal senator then contacted the US Attorney's Office, not the US Attorney. What was her name? Reno?
Oh, Attorney General.
Attorney
Janet
General.
Reno.
They contacted the Attorney General, who contacted CRS, who told me, never go to that town again. So yeah, sometimes there'd be a problem. But in terms of a school system telling me that, or a police department telling me that, no, because that was my lane.
Right. It's coming from a elected official to a senator to
Yeah.
DOJ. That's a long process. Excellent. So
I
I
would have
wonder.
preferred, by the way, I would have preferred the CRS director to turn around and say, that's our job. But politically speaking, that was not the smartest thing that particular director could have done.
Sure. If they were
I
confirmed
would
by
have
the
done
Senate,
that, by the way.
yeah. If
Which
they were
should
confirmed by the Senate, maybe that's a little different. But if they were an interim, that's a problem.
well, it should explain my meteoric rise to the top of civil service.
Fair enough. So let's talk about that meteoric rise. You, in the prior history, described your move to CRS. At one point in time, you were at a different federal agency, and they said, "Hey, look, we're going to downgrade you to do crossword puzzles and come to work, but not do the substantive stuff anymore." And so you leapt over to CRS. And so I wonder, from your experience at CRS, there were a number of transitions between administrations, whether it was perhaps Bush to Clinton, Clinton to Bush to Obama. How do changes in federal administrations affect your work? Do you have any specific examples of how they affected your work at CRS?
Different administrations had different priorities. Under the Democrats, they were more open to accepting CRS as an entity and encouraging us to go out and do our job. Under, let's see, I was there for Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2. I think that's it. Under those administrations, we were encouraged to not be aggressive, to not be proactive, and to be to wait until the riot happened and then go in. And the system would change. They would say, okay, under this administration, if you go out and do a training, we're going to count that as a case. Under the next administration, they would say, no, that doesn't count as a case. Don't do that. Just don't do that. So again,
just don't do the training, or don't count it as a case.
Both. So you felt more restrained under certain administrations than you did under others.
Did you?
That's just a function of federal employment. I'm sure that's true. Well, when I first started with the federal government, I worked for the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was a grant program. And one administration was get out and fund as much progressive stuff as possible. The next administration was get out and fund as many weapons as possible. So it just becomes a question of who's in charge, the left or the right. Okay,
that makes sense. I think. Thank you. So I want to talk about some other changes, more broad changes that may have affected your work. Specifically, were there any changes during your career at CRS with respect to policing that impacted your work, either on a global level or if there are any specific changes in communities that impacted your work that you can recall?
Yeah, I think that there were changes in the policing business. In the 60s, police community relations was put on the table. And in the 70s and the 80s, it became part of the vernacular. So there was a gradual movement from strict law enforcement to a more open and certainly more educated police staffing. In the early 60s, you needed a high school diploma to become a New York City police officer. I live in Howard County, Maryland now, and you need at least an associate's degree to be considered to become a police officer in Howard County. And there are other police departments that require a 4-year degree just to become a patrol officer. So the educational level has shot up considerably. Part of that is a result of a federal program called LEAP, Law Enforcement Education Program, in which people could go to college and get the government to pay for it if they became involved in the law enforcement business. I went to graduate school on a LEAP money, which was wonderful, by the way. Thank you very much. And I worked in prisons at the time. So there's been this gradual movement to expand the horizons for what policing is and what police officers do. When we look at situations like Grand Rapids or the other prime examples, Breonna Taylor with the no-knock warrant, that's going backwards. That's the bad old days. And so, yeah, I think there has been changes, gradual changes in law enforcement that are very encouraging. If you look at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, almost all of those leaders at that level have advanced degrees. They're lawyers. They're PhDs. And if you gone are the days when somebody with a high school diploma worked their way up to become the chief. You don't become the chief unless, in addition to getting the high school diploma, you get a college degree along the way. That you go to the FBI Academy along the way. And there are several other, benchmarks that show a difference between what was and what is. So yeah, I think that we've made wonderful progress and we have leagues to go.
So same question, but with respect to the justice system itself. Or actually, let me take a step back. So you've seen the progress. There are leagues to go with respect to policing. There's been progress in community policing, the understanding of it, as well as the education of our police and law enforcement force. How did that impact your work as a conciliator? How did that slow transition impact your work?
Yeah, I think it made it easier because I could talk to line police officers and not have to, kind of dumb down. The young police officers were eager to expand their knowledge of alternatives to force, of de-escalation, of things like that. And they got more and improved training. In the old days, you were trained, this is your gun, these are the bullets, write a report if you use the gun. Well, there's a lot more to it today than there was then. Doesn't mean that every officer is, super cop and super trained and super wonderful. We still have police who make mistakes and police who shouldn't be police.
Yeah, thank you. So same set of questions with respect to the justice system. Have you noticed changes with respect to the justice system in your career, and how have they impacted your work as a conciliator?
Interesting question. We didn't have as many consent decrees between the Department of Justice and local police departments in the 60s that we had in the 70s and 80s, and 90s and 2000. I just read of one, I can't remember where it was. They just had a consent decree. So in that respect, that's a good thing. The level and number of federal prosecutions and trials of local police, I think are, and again, this has to do with administrations. Under the Trump administration, they were very low. Under the Biden, they're growing higher. So that, for me, that's a good thing. It's a pendulum kind of thing, depending on who's, which administration is in charge. But even then, the pendulum used to swing from way over here to way over here. Now it just swings from here to here, because certain things are now well understood and accepted.
And with respect to consent decrees, how's that evolution changed the role of the conciliator?
I don't think it's changed the role of conciliators. I think that some police departments might require a little more convincing because they're afraid of the consent decrees. I don't think that it changes really much what we do or how we do it, or how it's done. And how.
Can you say a little bit for us about whether, as a conciliator, you were involved in helping develop a consent decree, or if CRS was asked to play a role in the formal consent decree itself post once the decree was issued? Are those roles CRS might play?
I personally was not. And I am aware that CRS has provided an alternative to a consent decree, where they came in and helped communities come together and make an agreement absent a consent decree. So we provided a more locally controlled response to change than having the federal come in and from above say, you must do this, 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 and this. And I know that Pat Glynn has been involved in a couple of really big cases that way. So are you going to talk to her?
We spoke once, and we're speaking again in a few weeks, I believe.
You might ask about that. She did some really powerful work in that particular area.
Okay,
Very complicated, very involved.
I appreciate your sharing that. We'll be sure to ask her that.
Tell her I said so.
Okay, I will, Tim. Wonderful. So, same set of questions. Have there been changes in the education system that have had an impact on your work at CRS?
Well, I know that the Department of Education has an Office of Civil Rights. And very often people would confuse us. You know, are you from the Department of Education? Are you accusing us of bias? So I think that having an Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education allowed the issue of civil rights to get a little more attention. So when we showed up, they understood what we were talking about. But sometimes we had to explain that, you know, we're not the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education or for the Department of Justice. We are a community relations service. And this is your chance to solve the problem yourselves, rather than wait for the feds.
So the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights may have helped folks you were working with better understand the work you were doing, but also maybe complicated the point of entry, which was probably easily overcome.
Yeah.
What anything else, any other changes in education? Well, I want to go to, sorry, go ahead.
Just a general level of awareness. I think that, and I guess it depends on where you're at. I live in Columbia, Maryland, which is in Howard County, which is one of the richest counties in America. Why am I here? And as a function of that, they attract highly qualified, highly educated teachers. And they attract them because they get paid pretty good. So with that faculty, you know, you're going to be, they're going to be a whole lot more aware than the faculty in Mississippi, who might not require a 4-year degree to be a teacher. You know, maybe they require only a 2-year degree, or maybe, you know, their standards are different than might be in Columbia, Maryland. So from that perspective, here, and for most of the people that I dealt with, they were a little more aware of civil rights and a little more aware of their role than they might be in another town.
So similar to the law enforcement
Yes.
example about education. There's also geographical variances, et cetera, but the point generally is that the education is more professionalized and highly paid, or has become more professionalized and highly paid, and there are geographical variations. One more question about changes. This one's different though, and then I'm going to loop back to something I neglected to cover earlier. How did the passage of the Shepard-Byrd Act in 2009 impact the scope of your work? Obviously, we know that the scope of the statutory mandate expanded. Beyond that, the expansion of the scope of the statutory mandate, how did your work as a conciliator change in your last few years at CRS due to the passage of Shepard-Byrd?
Honestly, it didn't. there was confusion on the part of the CRS administration as to what exactly we could do or should be doing with respect to these other groups that we could attend to. We basically attended to race, color, and national origin. And now they want to talk about sexual orientation, physical and mental disabilities, and we looked at global kinds of things, you know, the memorandums of understanding between CRS and some national gay group or mental health group or whatever. But in terms of individual cases, not so much. And I think part of that is because it was ingrained in CRS that we didn't do individual cases. We did cases that impacted the whole community. And so if there were a case about a school district not responding to the mentally challenged correctly enough, it was just one guy. You know, it wasn't a whole group of people. So I never got involved in any of those cases. I never got involved in a case involving anything other than race, color, and national origin. And that might be my fault. I should have been more aggressive about it. But we were not provided training or opportunities to recognize cases that might involve those kinds of groups. Today, I think would be a little bit different because today there are more middle school and high school clubs that cater to gay kids. Although I suppose that's grooming. But there are, if there were a complaint about discrimination towards gay students, it would be more than one student. And we might get involved with an organization like Pride and sit down with them and sit down with the school and see, what might come. But by 2011, because I retired January 1st, 2012. I just was not involved in that.
No, the act had just been passed in 2009. And so I do imagine it takes time to develop new training, new protocols at CRS, which is, as a small agency, I understand can move somewhat swiftly for government, but still takes time.
I would point out that my hero, Bob Lamb, was adamantly opposed to expanding the mandate. Adamantly opposed. And I said, well, Bob, why are you so opposed? He says, we're not handling what we got.
Okay, so he was adamantly opposed because of CRS's staffing level. Is that right? I wonder how, the way I read the original mandate, it does not include religious issues. Correct. And I understand CRS has worked on a number of religious issues prior to the expansion. Now, Shepherd Bird includes religious, but how did you engage in a community-wide issue connected to religious tension under the original mandate, or did you say, look, we don't have jurisdiction here?
Race, color, or national origin, and what I think the administration did was they bent national origin to include people from Israel or people who adhere to the religion or to the politics of that. So that allowed us to respond to Nazi signs on synagogue walls and things like that.
Sure. Or 9/11, when there were a lot of concerns in the Muslim and Arab communities.
Right.
That right. Okay. And that makes sense. It's easier when religion is specifically articulated to do that work and say, look, jurisdiction, religion, here it is, instead of national origin. So
Right.
bending the language, I hear you there. Okay, one question I forgot to, or well, I identified and then we just got on to other topics, but I wanted to loop back to something you raised earlier. Specifically, remember, I said, you were actually talking about social media and said, look, it allowed movements, Black Lives Matter and similar movements to blossom. But then you also said there are some other forces on the left and the right that do outlandish things that are housed essentially, a lot of what is known publicly about them is on social media. And so I wonder, can you talk about how those other, in your words, outlandish movements on the right and the left, not talking about BLM, I'm not talking about Blue Lives Matter, but the other outlandish movements impacted your work as a conciliator? That could be white supremacists or, Antifa might be put in that groups or parts of Antifa. I'm not sure, but what's your perspective there?
Those groups are extremist groups.
Mhm.
And extremist groups generally don't want to sit down and talk. They want to win. They want to crush the opponent. The Nazis wanted to crush everybody. And the Klan wants to throw out all people of color. It's just where they come from. In order for me to do my job, I have to have two sides agree to sit down and communicate with one another, to work towards resolution. And with the extremist groups, I don't get that. So I can't do the job. I can't, there's no point in my getting these two groups to come together and spit at each other. There's no point to it. If I could convince them that it would be in both their interests to do that, then I got a shot. But for the extremist groups, that just never worked.
So there were no examples you could cite where, say, for example, you in your role were at or playing some role with respect to demonstrations around a white supremacist event on a public square. So what I'm hearing is you wouldn't be able to gain entry. They wouldn't want to engage with you, and so you didn't.
Yeah, the best we could do. I'll give you a couple examples. The Klan went to a town and asked permission to hold a meeting in a meeting room in the public library. And the public library said, sure, that's available. So the anti-Klan people found out about it. And they decided that they would pack the room with anti-Klan people.
They would, I'm sorry, say that again, they would pack the room?
Pack the room, yeah. They would go to the library, fill it full of anti-Klan people. And when they got there, the Klan people had already filled up the room. So now the anti-Klan people are outside the library, yelling and screaming and, all terrible things. And the main speaker for the Klan group had not arrived. So when he did arrive in full regalia, the anti-Klan people went crazy. And we said to the Klan guy, I'm sorry, the room is already filled and you can't go in. And he said, well, I'm the head Kluxer, you know, I'm the reason they're here. Well, I'm sorry, the room is filled, you can't go in. He said, well, you know, we got to do something. I said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you go in there and get 10 people in that room out of the room, and then you and your party can go in the room. Right? And they did do that, and he went in and, you know, sputtered whatever foolishness they do. But we didn't resolve any hate. We didn't resolve any animosity between the Klan and the anti-Klan. All we did was move things along a little bit.
Yeah.
There was another incident, Klan versus anti-Klan. And on the day of the incident, what we tried to do was keep the anti-Klan and the Klan separated. And so that if they got too close, they might hit each other or worse. So our job was to just keep them separated. And we did that, not through mediation. We did that just by talking, just by saying, you know, come over here and talk to me for a minute. And
were there physical barriers? Did they respect decisions about space?
Some did, some did not. In one instance, there was a march, and the anti-marchers were behind a barrier, and every once in a while they'd pop out, you know, saying, you know, I'll show you, I'll show you. And so our job at that point was to go to that I'll show you guy, right, and say, oh, wait a minute, you know, talk to me for a minute over here. And, you know, 2 minutes later, the people he was pointing at had already gone 2 blocks away. And so he had nothing to shout about. Those instances, though, that's crowd control. That's not mediation. That's not resolution. That's just simply, let's get it, you know, let's let them keep going. And there were philosophical differences within CRS about whether that was our role or not. I felt it was, that it was our role to contribute to a peaceful demonstration, meaning one that where people didn't get hurt and property didn't get damaged. Yet there were others who said, well, that's, you know, I'm a mediator, so I don't do that. Okay. In fact, we had one guy, former police officer, who said, when we responded to these kinds of situations, we shouldn't even show up publicly. We just go to a hotel and wait for violence to happen and then go. Yeah.
Interesting. So that there was some tension there within CRS internally, how to respond to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the tension from my former colleague's point of view, he was a police officer. He's saying that's police work. You shouldn't be involved. And from my point of view is, I'm not arresting anybody. I'm just keeping people separate, and that's what, you know, peacemakers do. You know, and maybe save room a week later, a month later, a year later, actually sitting down together and coming to some resolution. But allowing the violence is going to help. And then, you know, according to the administration, whoever was in charge and whoever was, you know, keep in mind that I served under John Mitchell, a convicted felon. So there's a whole range of approaches that people, you know, did and made, and I,
Okay.
like I said, I erred on the let's keep peace sign.